Hey, Scott Horton here to tell you about this great new book by Michael Swanson, The War State. In The War State, Swanson examines how Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy both expanded and fought to limit the rise of the new national security state after World War II. If this nation is ever to live up to its creed of liberty and prosperity for everyone, we are going to have to abolish the empire. Know your enemy. Get The War State by Michael Swanson. It's available at your local bookstore or at Amazon.com in Kindle or in paperback. Just click the book in the right margin at scotthorton.org or thewarstate.com.
All right, y'all, Scott Horton Show. I'm him. Check out the website, scotthorton.org. I got more than 4,000 interviews going back to 2003 there, scotthorton.org. Sign up for the podcast feed and follow me on Twitter at Scott Horton Show. All right, everybody, introducing the great Patrick Cockburn, Middle East correspondent for The Independent in Britain. That's independent.co.uk. And they reprint all his stuff also at unz.com, U-N-Z, unz.com. And the very latest is ISIS unleashes death squads as Iraqi forces advance on Fallujah. Also at issue, another recent one after the recent battles in Syria and Iraq. How close is ISIS to losing the war? We'll talk about that a little bit. Well, it's all one big story, isn't it? Welcome back to the show, Patrick. How are you, sir?
I'm fine, thank you.
Let me mention the book here, too. It's Chaos and Caliphate. Jihadis and the West in the Struggle for the Middle East. It's at OR Books. And it's a huge one, too. A compendium of an entire terror war worth of articles and essays. All right. Yeah, the attack on Fallujah, I guess, at least as far as artillery, it's on. Can you tell us much more about the Iraqi government, Shia government's forces and their assault on the town of Fallujah?
Yeah, it's a very complicated business because there are a lot of people involved, a lot of people who dislike each other, maybe only a little bit less than they dislike Islamic State. Fallujah, as people may know, is about 40 miles west of Baghdad. It was captured by Islamic State, ISIS, Daesh, ISIL, whatever you want. I'm going to call it ISIS for the on this occasion in January 2014. It was the first big victory of ISIS, and the Iraqi government hasn't been able to get them out since. In Baghdad, there's a deep feeling that Fallujah, which is a Sunni Arab city, is the source of many of the suicide bombs that have killed thousands of people, mostly almost all civilians, almost all Shia in Baghdad. And so one of the reasons we have this offensive now is that about 200 people were killed earlier in the month by these suicide bombers. So the demands the government do something about it. Inside Fallujah, used to be a city of about 350,000, kind of trucking town. It's on the road to Jordan, also known for being a center for Islamic fundamentalism, for Sunni fundamentalism. There are about 60,000 people that left there now. Maybe people say 900 IS fighters. I don't know. Have they counted them? Do they stand in ranks so they can be counted? And around it, you've got the Iraqi army, which is advancing, which is not that big. They've got a couple of brigades of special forces, 2 divisions they can use. Rather bigger are a group called the Hashd al-Shabi, which is the militias, which were raised in 2014 to fight ISIS. And these are both Shia and Sunni. The Shia ones are disliked by the US because they're Shia and some of them, not all, are backed by Iran. You also have Sunni militias. Now, the coalition today said that they would bomb in southern Fallujah in support of the Iraqi army and the Sunni militias, but not the attackers on the east and west of Fallujah. And you'd think Fallujah is not a big place, so it's you have to be rather careful on who you're bombing in support of. What's going to happen? Well, the ISIS is pretty good at house-to-house fighting using snipers and IEDs, improvised explosive devices, that is, mortars and so forth. They can fight a long time. The question is, will the Fallujah be destroyed? Because Ramadi was recaptured by the Iraqi army, backed by very intense US-led airstrikes some months ago, and which is great, except Ramadi doesn't really exist anymore, because most of it's been destroyed by the same airstrikes. So I was talking to somebody yesterday who's from there. He said only about 15% of the population was back months after it had been recaptured.
Mm. All right, well, for now, back to the headline about these death squads, and the lead in the article is about Islamic State fighters warning people that even civilians, they're not allowed to flee Fallujah. They're trying to make a little Stalingrad out of it. Is that right?
Yeah, that's kind of the shape of things in these cities. I don't know about Stalingrad, but they don't want the civilians out because they know that that will make it more easier for the US and the coalition to bomb them. So they want the civilians to stay. So you might have a building, let's say, of 5 stories, and 4 stories have families in them, and the 5th floor has ISIS fighters in them. The Iraqi army has been saying people should walk along the main road out of the town, which is full of mines and bombs and snipers, and houses that want to surrender should wave a white flag as a way of ending up dead very soon. This is probably difficult to surpass, because ISIS would shoot you immediately. Mm. Also, it doesn't do you much good waving a white flag, because ISIS fighting positions often do that just to lure Iraqi government forces forward and then open up.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, I don't know how to do it on a scale of 1 to 10 or on a scale of Baiji to Ramadi or how you measure it, but do you have a guess about how hard they're going to fight for the city as compared to just try to melt away and live to fight another day for Mosul or another town later?
Couldn't say. I don't think they'll melt away just like that, which they did in some recent places. There's a town called Raqqa, right over towards on the Syrian border, and another place called Heat, which they didn't fight for. But these are kind of smallish places. Fallujah is much bigger. It's more important. It's close to Baghdad. It has political and military significance, because Fallujah, remember, was the center of the uprising against the U.S. in 2004, was the target of 2 sieges by the U.S. Marines, famous at the time. And also it was their first great victory. So I don't think they'll just sort of pull out, but they may not absolutely, pour all their troops in. There was at the end of 2014, there was ISIS, besieged a Kurdish town called Kobani, you might remember it, and, just kept at it and lost, 2,000 men, to airstrikes. I doubt if it'll do that again, but I don't think it'll pull out again. So exactly how they play it, difficult to predict.
Mm. And now you talk about the decimation of Ramadi. I wonder about whether, well, I guess there's not much to come back to, but the early indications seem to show that the Shiite militias want to go ahead and cleanse the town and take it and keep it for the Shia and expand the borders of Shiistan to Ramadi, or not?
Well, Scott, they don't have to cleanse it because it's a heap of ruins,
It's just...
and isn't anybody there. I mean, to cleanse people, if you want to sort of rush in and say, here I am, the Shia militia, I'm going to kill all.
Well, but I mean, do they plan on keeping them from coming home?
They've all, most of them are up in, they're up in Kurdistan or they're elsewhere. They're displaced people.
Well, you know what I mean, though. I mean, do you think they want to let the Sunni ever come home, or they're just going to keep it now?
Well, this is, it's not exactly the militias, because they aren't really in Ramadi. It's mostly army. But the government, this is a Shia government. People from there, they're not so much frightened of the army. It's more the interior ministry troops. And there are at least said to be 1,000 people there from Ramadi in a very small prison. And, it's very hot up out there, without space to lie down, people being tortured, people being shot. That's what people talk about. I mean, I can't authenticate that, but that's what Sunni were talking about to me. And there was an Amnesty report recently about this particular prison.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it seemed like the Baghdad government position before the rise of Islamic State was basically more or less let Sunnistan go and go bake in the sun and tough for them. Now, obviously, they want to fight the Islamic State, but it's a pretty big question, isn't it, whether they want to really conquer and rule these areas that before were predominantly Sunni, or whether they want to get rid of Islamic State, but more or less still let Sunnistan go.
No, I'm not sure. I think it worked a little different. Initially, they held it all. They marginalized the Sunni, and that would have worked, except the Sunni and you had the uprising in Syria, and that sort of changed the balance of power in the region. And first of all, you had protests among the Sunni. You're about a fifth of the Iraqi population. There are about 33 million Iraqis. So we're talking about 6-7 million people. The protest didn't get anywhere. They tried to transmute it into armed resistance. The armed resistance was taken over by ISIS. Do they want to recapture Mosul? Yeah, they do. Do they want to recapture the rest? Yeah, they do, but there are also, as you said, doubts about it. Can they hold it? Do they want to hold it? They'd quite like to hold it, but are they prepared to get a lot of people killed? Do a lot of people want to, are families prepared to see their sons killed trying to get these places back? That's a slightly different question. The US is pushing hard for an attack on recapture of Mosul, the recapture of Raqqa. But when I talked to senior Iraqi officials, they said it's not going to happen this year.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it seems like from the daily news, the Baghdad government can barely hold it together on a day-to-day basis anyway. It seems like conquering these places, not just driving Islamic State out, but trying to really expand their borders and all that would be biting off far more than they could chew at this point.
It might be. Iraq's a funny place. It never quite falls apart, but it never quite comes together. There are people who've got sort of centers of power. It might be the Kurds or the different Kurdish parties. It might be the Shia, the Sunni. All these groups are divided within themselves, and certainly the Kurds are divided. What kind of holds them together is fear of Islamic State. The Shia, very divided as well. The government, you can't has some force, military force. It has some money, it has US support. So you can't rule them out. They're not negligible, but they don't control the game either.
Yeah. Well, now, as far as the current assault on Fallujah, does this include massive airstrikes like Ramadi so far?
Not so far, but might be. I think there's some embarrassment, or there ought to be some embarrassment about what happened in Ramadi, because, this was declared to be the great victory, but, by the Iraqi army and forces, but it certainly wasn't by them. They're quite small detachments of special forces. Some say only about 750 men were really in the front line and really calling in airstrikes that sort of battered the place to pieces. And surviving ISIS members, eventually left. So, if this had been in the Vietnam War or some other wars, there would have been more of an international outcry about this. But because it was against ISIS, who are considered, international pariahs with some reason, and because not many people could go there to see what had happened, there hasn't really been any sort of protests about what happened. It might be a bit more embarrassing if they did the same thing to Fallujah or Mosul. But we'll see. It hasn't happened yet. But you can see, bombs landing and sort of spouts of smoke going up and so forth. But we'll wait and see.
And now you also say in your article too that, there are reports that you're hearing there in Kurdistan out of Fallujah that the humanitarian situation for the average Joe is also really bad right now there.
Yeah, people are saying just sort of absence of food because this place is sort of besieged, and there is sort of one road in, but everything is very expensive. You hear the same thing in Mosul, and there isn't much money to buy these things. Because people have been in that, Mosul has been in a near sort of state of war since early 2014 when Islamic State took over. So, there isn't, people have run through what money they had. So people are talking about, a 50 kilo bag of flour costing, $700-800. And most people can't afford that. So, and I hear the same thing from Mosul, that there isn't very little in the shops. The prices have sort of shot up over the last year. It didn't happen initially when Islamic State took over, but it's happened since. So, also absence of electricity and fresh water and stuff like that.
Yeah. All right, now, so let's talk again, if we could, about Muqtada al-Sadr, the Shiite cleric, and sometimes backer of the government to some degree. And he and his guys keep marching on the green zone, and they keep getting further and further into power. It seems like they're right on the eve of an actual revolution, but they keep backing down. What's the status of all of that?
Well, yeah, I mean, in one way, yes, they breached the green zone, which has been this sort of center of power since, Saddam used to be there, but it became a sort of fortified enclave under Bremer when the U.S. moved in, the Iraqi government, the same thing. It's kind of a sort of forbidden city. To my mind, a thoroughly bad thing, because it means the rulers can sort of sit behind their fortifications without really much idea of what's happening in the rest of Iraq, and maybe not caring too much what happens in the rest of Iraq. And the only time they leave will be to go to the airport, to go to their houses in Europe or Jordan or somewhere like that. So, progressively, the followers of Muqtada, the Sadrists, they broke in, and now they've done it again. A couple of people were shot. Muqtada said he wasn't so responsible for the latest one. This does lead to a sort of this does empower the streets to a degree, but I think Muqtada they don't want, in a way they can influence, maybe for a time control popular feeling in the streets, but they're very frightened of having a rerun of 2003 of a sort of mass looting of all government buildings. A lot of poor people in Baghdad, who, if they poured into the green zone would simply, remove everything that's isn't nailed down and, a lot that is. So, and then the army might move in, a lot of people might get shot. So Muqtada is looking for reform rather than revolution. Mm-hmm. Whether that's feasible, I don't know. I suspect the Iraqi system is pretty irreformable, actually. It's kind of gelled. You have people who've got their interests in sort of running all the ministries and the government and so forth. I'm not sure they're going to cede much or any power.
Yeah. Well, and as you've talked about on the show before, their budget and their economic system in, Iraqi Shiistan is just, it's an equation for bankruptcy at today's oil prices. They just can't do it.
It looks like that. I mean, the price of oil has gone up, which must be a relief to them. It's, $50 or something now. I don't know what the Iraqis are netting out of that, but they're getting a bit more money. The thing is, you have a very corrupt system. Second, you have a kind of patronage system, a client system, like Tammany Hall in New York, 100 years ago, that, people have jobs, or at least they're on the payroll. If you're, close to the ruling party, you're on the payroll, and you may do some work, you may not. Your guys get the contracts. It's sort of corrupt, but a lot of people are involved. So, to pay, there are about 7 million people in Iraq who get pay or pensions from the state, and that costs about $4 billion a month. Recently, their revenues are running about $2 billion a month. So they are running through their reserves. They can borrow some money. They can sort of probably keep it going to the end of the year, but it's getting very tight.
Yeah. Well, and so no wonder there's all the pressure for reform, but I guess, as you've also described and as you're just saying, it's sort of too far gone, right? It's such a kleptocracy that's been built up here.
It's a kleptocracy, but it's also, I mentioned Tammany Hall. There are quite a lot of people who benefit from that system, and that means it's quite difficult, it's even more difficult to get rid of. I think there are some states in sort of sub-Saharan Africa where everything gets stolen by an elite, which may just take off, when there's a revolution. But in Iraq and, these oil states, the guys at the top steal a very large quantity, but there's kind of this sort of, as I said, sort of patronage system that if you're on the right side of the government, quite a lot of people are getting money, and they don't necessarily want that to change.
Right. So they're smart enough to bring enough people in on it, but they're too clever by half because now they're stuck between a rock and a hard place when they just can't afford to keep it going.
It all works until the price of oil goes down.
Right.
You have to have the money. It's the same up in Kurdistan, where I am at the moment. That it used to be they used to advertise themselves the other Iraq, that worked, that wasn't so corrupt. Actually, it worked exactly the same way in Baghdad. That they had revenues either from Iraqi oil revenues or their own oil revenues. And there was fantastic corruption at the top. But you had about 700,000 people on the state payroll, most of whom are not being paid at the moment. So there's nothing else. These oil states, I don't know if you know about the resource curse. If you have a state that depends on oil or gas or minerals and nothing else, often, just all other sort of forms of economic activity end because everything's too expensive and it's cheaper to import it. So if you're in Baghdad or you're up here, even the sort of tomatoes you get come from Iran. Everything else you eat, probably up here, about 90% comes from outside the country. And that works until the oil revenue stops, and then it stops working.
Yeah. All right. Now, if I can ask you a couple Syria questions here real quick. Well, there's a few different ones. First of all, am I really, I keep hearing this, but I don't know much about it. Is it right that America and Russia both support the Syrian Kurds in their fight against the Islamic State? And I know there are some special forces, U.S. special forces embedded with them, but they say now approximately 300. But I don't know much about the Russian role in that. And then if you could also just talk about whatever progress they're making against the Islamic State on their side of the war.
Well, the Syrian Kurds have been doing quite well. They belong to the PK Kurd. They have their own group called the YPG, which is about 25, 30,000 pretty well-trained, disciplined troops. And they are really the Syrian branch of the Kurdistan Workers' Party of Turkey. And they get support from the U.S., obviously, when they're advancing, from U.S. airstrikes. They say they weren't getting weapons, but the airstrikes are very important. From the Russians, getting some air support as well. Not quite so much. What worries the Kurds there and here is, it's okay so long as they're the big local ground allies, supplying ground troops against Daesh, against ISIS. But what happens to them if, let's say, Daesh disappears, gets defeated? Is the U.S. going to support them against Turkey? Is it going to support them against Damascus? Iraqi Kurds ask the same question. They say everybody loves us only internationally while we're fighting ISIS. But what happens if there's no more ISIS? Then they'll feed us to the dogs. So there's that feeling in Kurdistan. I mean, somebody was saying to me yesterday, an Iraqi Kurd who knows who's been around, and he was saying, we're kind of, the U.S. government doesn't have employed Blackwater anymore, to do its fighting for it. It has us instead. So we Kurds are sort of the new Blackwater, for the U.S. government. There's quite a lot of truth in that.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, in American politics, that's what they all say. Oh, yeah, we got to fight them, but, we're going to make the Kurds do it for us. We got to arm the Kurds. And so, I mean, they're talked about in exactly that way. They exist only to serve as our foot soldiers in a war we don't want to fight anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And they also feel pretty vulnerable because they know their neighbors, in Baghdad and Damascus and Ankara and Iran for that matter, don't like them very much, So they really need that support, and they think they'll be hung out to dry if they're not needed. And Daesh, because Daesh has gone down.
Yeah.
So that worries them, and I think they're right to be worried.
Well, now, so I've heard at least some of their leaders say that they prefer Assad to a revolution against him, and Daesh or al-Nusra or whatever other groups taking power in Damascus in place of him. But I don't know really much about the Damascus regime's relationship with the Syrian Kurds before that, or I don't know if you could, take a guess at what it might be in the future.
The regime always oppressed the Kurds. It marginalized them. A lot of them weren't even citizens. The first real uprising against Assad was in 2004 by the Kurds. As they point out, the first people to be sort of knocking over statues of Assad, Hafiz al-Assad, were the Kurds. They now say, but look, the so-called al-Nusra and the other opposition, and all fight together against us, and say they have no intention of giving the Kurds autonomy, and seem to be viscerally anti-Kurdish. So, they feel bad as Assad is, that the opposition are even worse.
Yeah. But then, so, if the day comes where the Islamic State's defeated, the al-Nusra Front's defeated, then next is a war between Damascus and Syrian Kurdistan? After their common enemies are out of the way?
Could be, yeah, they don't have U.S. support, whoever is in Damascus is reasserting control over the country. They could find, that they were, oppressed once more or just driven out of the country, That's kind of what Saddam did in 91. They feel in some ways they're very powerful at the moment because they've got the US and Russia backing them, but just for how long they feel. So they're strong momentarily, but weak in the long term.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, so I guess it seemed like the so-called ceasefire was to a great degree dependent on the Ahrar al-Sham and the other groups splitting off from the al-Nusra Front, and that never seemed to happen. And so the Russians are still bombing America's allies there, and the Americans seem to just keep on supporting or at least some of the jihadist groups against Assad.
It's always been a bit of a myth that there is a sort of opposition of significance which is separate from ISIS and al-Nusra. So, at one point the Russians were saying, and I think at one point the Americans, Kerry, agreed, that those opposition, the so-called moderate opposition that were not, should sort of physically separate themselves on the ground from al-Nusra, so the US and the Russians could sort of bomb them. The opposition didn't, because it can't, because it's not strong enough, and it knows that if it did, without al-Nusra, first of all, the Syrian army would roll over it. And secondly, if it tried, al-Nusra would probably shoot them. So, it's one of the curious things about this war. There's this sort of pretense that there's a sort of third way, that there's a Syrian moderate, non-fundamentalist Islamist opposition, which doesn't exist. And not only do people sort of, if it were just propaganda, it would be one thing, but actually sort of US policy for a long time was based on the fact that this non-existent group existed.
Yeah. Well, the way they say is, the FSA groups, so Jaish al-Islam and this, that, the other thing that, they don't behead or at least as much as al-Nusra and ISIS and, and after all, they do have different names, so if they were really exactly the same, they would just call themselves al-Nusra, right?
Yeah, but you see Jaish al-Islam, they made a propaganda video about the Druze, saying, in which became very clear that they regarded the Druze, this 3% small minority there, as non-Islamic and people you could enslave, according to, their extreme variant of Islam. So they're not really, ideologically, they're not really much different from al-Nusra and ISIS.
Yeah. Well, and even going back to the earlier days of the war, Northern Storm Brigade that met with John McCain, their guys were on video, Time Magazine, saying, yeah, we fought with Zarqawi against the Americans in Iraq War II, and we're proud of that. But anyway, thanks for the support. They're pretty moderate.
Yeah,
veterans of the last war.
They're sort of deception, self-deception on the part of the US, and sometimes not, but sometimes they know exactly what these guys are like, but sort of pretend otherwise. Mm-hmm. It's prevented any real policy emerging. My own feeling is you can't the only thing, what you need to do is sort of have, the war, the level of violence reduced. The politics of war are very different from the politics of peace. In the politics of war, extreme, groups that are prepared to get killed, like Islamic State and al-Nusra and Jaish al-Islam, they come to the fore. People who feel differently, don't want to get killed, don't want to carry a gun, or aren't very good at it. They're marginalized. Similarly, in Damascus, currently people who maybe don't much like Assad, but feel that the alternative is guys are going to chop their heads off and force their wives and daughters to be covered from head to foot in black cloth. They think, we prefer to stick with Assad. If you couldn't stop the war even for a time, then people in Damascus would begin to think they've got other alternatives.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, there doesn't seem to be too many of those. And now as far as Turkish support, Phil Giraldi, the former CIA officer who was stationed in Turkey back when he was a CIA officer, said that he went there, I guess, in 2013, 2014, and there were guys raising money for the Islamic State on the street. No problem whatsoever. I guess in Ankara or Istanbul, I forget. And I just wondered, what exactly do you measure the Turkish level, or how do you measure the Turkish level of support for Islamic State? And has it changed at all?
Yeah, I think they're now fairly hostile to Islamic State. They gave they tolerated them before. They allowed them to move backwards and forward across the border. All these thousands of foreign volunteers came across the Turkish border. The Turks say somehow they couldn't detect them. They were wearing long beards and so forth. Of course they could. Now they're more hostile to them, but they still sort of seem to cooperate with or tolerate al-Nusra and the various other groups, and pretend there are a whole lot of groups. That
are they no longer buying Islamic State oil?
No, probably a bit is coming through. It's more difficult to do now because the Syrian Kurds have closed a lot of the border. Mm-hmm. And there is oil that there used to be oil coming out, used to go over to the sort of Western rebels who sent food back to Islamic State areas. And then used to go up to the Turkish border. All from this is that they sell it from the wellhead to guys, put it in their tank, take a risk, hope to make a bit of a profit. And that'll go across to Turkey. It'll go all over the place. It goes from one buyer to another.
Thank you so much for your time. Sorry for keeping you so long, but I really appreciate you talking to me as always, Patrick.
Not at all. All the very best.
That's the great Patrick Cockburn, y'all, author of Chaos and Caliphate, Jihadis and the West in the Struggle for the Middle East. And, of course, you find him at independent.co.uk and uns.com. This one is ISIS Unleashes Death Squads as Iraqi forces advance on Fallujah. And the other, after the recent battles in Syria and Iraq, how close is ISIS to losing the war? Hey, and thanks, y'all, for listening. Sign up for the podcast feed at scotthorton.org. Check out the archives there. Check out scotthorton.org/donate if you want to help support the show. And follow me on Twitter at Scott Horton Show. Hey, Al Scott here. If you've got a band, a business, a cause, or campaign, and you need stickers to help promote, check out thebumpersticker.com at thebumpersticker.com. They digitally print with solvent ink, so you get the photo quality results of digital with the strength and durability of old-style screen printing. I'm sure glad I sold thebumpersticker.com to Rick back when. He's made a hell of a great company out of it, and there are thousands of satisfied customers who agree with me, too. Let thebumpersticker.com help you get the word out. That's thebumpersticker.com at thebumpersticker.com. Hey, y'all, Scott Horton here for WallStreetWindow.com. Mike Swanson knows his stuff. He made a killing running his own hedge fund and always gets out of the stock market before the government-generated bubbles pop, which is, by the way, what he's doing right now, selling all his stocks and betting on gold and commodities. Sign up at WallStreetWindow.com and get real-time updates from Mike on all his market moves.
It's hard to know how to protect your savings and earn a good return in an economy like this. Mike Swanson can help. Follow along on paper and see for yourself. WallStreetWindow.com. Hey, all, Scott Horton here to tell you about this great new ebook by longtime Future Freedom author Scott McPherson. Freedom and Security, the Second Amendment and the Right to Keep and Bear Arms. This is the definitive principled case in favor of gun rights and against gun control. America is exceptional. Here the people come first, and we refuse to allow the state a monopoly on firearms. Our liberty depends on it. Get Scott McPherson's Freedom and Security, the Second Amendment and the Right to Keep and Bear Arms on Kindle at Amazon.com today.